She was the Starlight Diner's best-kept secret, a woman with a supermodel's figure poured into a simple uniform, her heart frozen in time. Then, a ghost in military dress blues walked in, and her entire world shattered with a single salute. The Starlight Diner was a pocket of preserved time on a street that had long since surrendered to modernity. Outside, traffic hummed and glass towers scraped the sky. Inside, the world slowed to the rhythm of a blues guitar drifting from a vintage jukebox and the low, comforting hiss of the espresso machine. It smelled of dark roast coffee, cinnamon, and something less tangible, waiting. At the center of this universe was Isabella Rossi. To the morning regulars, she was a paradox. At 40, Isabella possessed a kind of potent, mature beauty that seemed utterly out of place amongst the sticky syrup dispensers and stacked paper napkins. Her raven black hair was usually twisted into a simple, elegant knot at the nape of her neck, though a few rebellious strands always escaped to frame a face with high cheekbones and striking emerald green eyes. But it was her figure that drew stunned, sideways glances from newcomers and appreciative, respectful nods from the old-timers. Isabella was statuesque, with an impossible S-curve silhouette. Her simple, powder blue work blouse was stretched taut across a chest that could have graced magazine covers. The fabric strained at the buttons, a constant, quiet testament to the lush, E-cup curves beneath, with the top two undone not for seduction, but out of sheer necessity. She moved with the unconscious grace of a dancer, her steps silent on the dark wood floors as she refilled coffee mugs and wiped down the red leather booths. She was the diner's lighthouse, a steady, beautiful, and profoundly solitary light. Frank, a retired journalist who occupied the corner booth every day from 7 to 9, had once tried to capture her in words for a column he never published. "She's a Rembrandt painting stuck in a Polaroid world," he'd mumbled into his coffee. "All that fire, banked down to embers." He was right. The fire was there, but it was banked behind a wall of quiet professionalism. For 5 years, since Major Leo Vance went missing on a classified mission, Isabella's world had shrunk to the walls of the Starlight Diner. The routine was her armor: unlock at dawn, grind the beans, polish the chrome, and exist within the hum of other people's lives. Her co-workers knew the basics, that her husband was a soldier, that he was gone. They didn't ask for details. They saw the way she would sometimes pause, her hand drifting to the silver locket that always rested in the hollow of her throat. They saw the flicker of pain in her emerald eyes before she blinked it away and asked a customer if they wanted a slice of apple pie. The locket was her most private ritual. Inside was a small, worn photo of her and Leo, taken the day before his final deployment. Him, impossibly handsome in his uniform, her, laughing into his eyes, her body pressed against his. Sometimes, in the quiet of the stockroom, she would click it open, her thumb tracing his smiling face, whispering the words she could never say aloud. Today was harder than most. The ache was a physical presence in her chest. She polished the counter, her reflection a distorted ghost in the gleaming surface. She saw the straining buttons of her blouse and remembered how Leo used to tease her, his voice a low rumble. "That uniform is a public safety hazard, Izzy." A sad smile touched her lips for a second before vanishing. The bell over the door jingled, pulling her back. Another customer. She didn't look up, her hands already reaching for a menu. She heard 2 truckers at the counter murmuring. "That's her, the one I told you about. Major Vance's wife. The one who went missing in the mountains. Man, that was years ago. She's still waiting." Isabella's back stiffened, but her expression remained a perfect, placid mask. She was used to being a local legend, a tragic love story people whispered about over their hash browns. She had stopped correcting them. Officially, Leo was missing, presumed dead. Unofficially, he was a ghost. And some days, she felt like she was the one haunting the world. The morning rush was beginning to ebb. The clock on the wall read 9:37 a.m. Isabella was by the jukebox, carefully wiping down the chrome buttons, when the bell over the door chimed again. It was a familiar sound, one she heard 100 times a day, but this time, it was different. A sudden, strange quiet fell over the diner. It wasn't silence, but a hushing of the ambient noise, as if a wave of pressure had rolled through the room. The B.B. King track playing on the jukebox seemed to be caught in a breath, the mournful guitar notes hanging in the air. The hiss of the espresso machine behind the counter sounded unnervingly loud. Conversations trailed off mid-sentence. Isabella turned, a damp cloth in her hand. Standing just inside the doorway, framed by the bright morning sun, was a man. He was tall, ramrod straight, and wearing the immaculate dress blues of a Marine Corps major. The polished metals on his chest caught the light, glinting like distant stars. His hat was tucked crisply under one arm. He wasn't the boyish, smiling man from her locket anymore. This man's face was leaner, carved from harder material. A thin, silvery scar cut a path from his right eyebrow to his cheekbone, a detail that made him a stranger. Her heart gave a painful, stuttering lurch. Soldiers came into the diner occasionally, recruiters on their lunch break, veterans meeting for coffee. But this felt different. The air itself felt heavy, charged with an impossible energy. The man's eyes, a deep and familiar shade of brown, scanned the room with a focused intensity. They passed over the booths, the counter, and the kitchen staff peering through the service window. Then, they landed on her. And they stopped. In that moment, the years, the distance, the grief, it all compressed into a single, silent point of contact. Those were Leo's eyes. They were no longer just sharp and proud, they were the eyes of a man who had walked through a storm, deep and weary, yet in them, she saw a flicker of the only star he'd been navigating by. Her breath hitched in her throat. The cloth fell from her numb fingers. He took a step forward. The sound of his polished boots on the dark wood floor was soft, but it echoed in the cavernous silence of the diner. He wasn't walking to a table. He wasn't heading for the counter. He was walking directly, unerringly, toward her. With every step he took, Isabella's carefully constructed world began to fracture. The calm, the routine, the 5 years of disciplined grief, it was all dissolving. Her mind screamed it's not possible, but her heart was pounding a frantic, undeniable rhythm against her ribs. Him. He stopped a few feet in front of her. He didn't speak. His lips parted slightly, as if the words were caught somewhere between his lungs and his mouth. He just looked at her, his gaze a physical touch, tracing the lines of her face as if memorizing her all over again. A single, hot tear broke free and traced a path down her cheek. The name, a sacred word she had held in the vault of her heart for half a decade, escaped her lips as a raw, broken whisper. Leo. The ghost in the uniform nodded once, his own eyes glassy with unshed tears. His voice, rougher and deeper than she remembered, was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. It's me, Izzy. The world tilted on its axis as Isabella staggered backward, one hand flying to her mouth to stifle a sob that tore its way up from the very core of her being. The metal tray of clean glasses she'd been holding slipped from her other hand. It hit the floor with a deafening crash. The sound of coffee cups and water glasses exploding on the wood floor was like a gunshot, ripping through the diner's stunned stillness. No one moved. Forks hung suspended halfway to open mouths. The cook, frozen behind the service window, held a spatula midair. Frank, the journalist in the corner, had his pen poised over his notepad, his jaw slack. A child in a high chair, who had been babbling happily, fell silent, his wide eyes fixed on the crying woman. The entire diner had become a tableau, every person a statue in a drama that felt too sacred to witness. They watched Isabella, her body trembling, her beautiful face a mask of disbelief and wrenching joy. They watched the soldier, whose gaze never left her. It was an impossible scene, a moment lifted from a half-forgotten black and white film. The local legend, the beautiful, waiting widow, and the ghost who was never supposed to come home. Leo took one more deliberate step forward, closing the distance between them. And then, he did something that no one expected. Something that wasn't for the crowd, or for ceremony, or for the country he served. It was only for her. He brought his heels together with a soft, definitive click. His back straightened, if possible, even more. His right hand rose in a slow, perfect arc to his brow. He saluted her. Isabella blinked through her tears, her breath catching in a sob. This salute, she knew this salute. She had seen it at his promotions, proud and formal. But this was different. This wasn't for Major Vance, the war hero. This was from Leo, the man. It was a gesture that spanned 5 years of hell, a silent acknowledgement of her own battle, her own unyielding watch. It was the highest honor he could bestow, a salute to the lighthouse that had guided him home. Her internal monologue screamed, "He's saluting me. For waiting. For not giving up. He sees me." The weight of that gesture, the sheer, crushing intimacy of it in this public space, finally broke the spell. A chair scraped against the floor. It was Frank. The cynical old journalist, his face a mixture of shock and profound respect, slowly pushed himself to his feet. He didn't take his eyes off the two of them. Then another patron stood. Then a family in a booth. One by one, in a slow, solemn wave that spread through the room, every customer, every worker, stood up. The truckers at the counter. The young couple by the window. The cook emerging from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. They stood in silent, reverent tribute. Isabella finally moved, collapsing into his arms. She clung to him, her fingers digging into the stiff fabric of his uniform, her face buried in his chest, inhaling the scent of him, assuring herself he was real, solid, and here. Leo held her tightly with one arm, his own body trembling slightly. With his other hand, he slowly, deliberately, lowered his salute. He turned his head, his gaze sweeping over the silent, standing crowd. His eyes weren't filled with pride, but with a deep, painful humility. He hadn't come back for this, for applause. He had only come back for her. But the honor in their eyes, the shared understanding of what this moment meant, moved him to his core. He gave a slight, solemn nod to the room. A thank you that was heavier than words. And then, as Isabella looked up at him, her face streaked with tears but shining with a love that had conquered death, the first, hesitant clap sounded. It came from Frank. It was followed by another, and another, until the Starlight Diner was filled not with wild applause, but with a slow, rhythmic, emotional ovation reserved for miracles. The applause eventually faded, replaced by a low, respectful murmur. The staff moved with a new, gentle purpose, clearing the broken glass and giving the corner booth a wide berth. Sarah, Isabella's youngest co-worker, quietly placed 2 steaming mugs of coffee on the table of what would forever be known as the lighthouse booth, whispering, "It's on the house." Isabella sat across from Leo, her hands wrapped around his. Her fingers traced the unfamiliar scar on his face, then the hard, calloused texture of his palms. He was real. The warmth of his skin was an anchor in the swirling sea of her emotions. For 5 years, she had spoken to a memory. Now, the memory was speaking back. "They told me you were a ghost, Leo," she whispered, her voice still raw. Her emerald eyes, shimmering with tears, finally met his. "Tell me, what was it like? Being a ghost?" A shadow passed over his face, and the light in his eyes dimmed. He looked down at their intertwined hands. "Cold," he said, his voice low and hollowed out. "And quiet. Too quiet." He began to speak, and the story unfolded, not all at once, but in jagged fragments, like memories clawed back from a great depth. The mission was deep reconnaissance in the Hindu Kush mountain range. High risk, no exit plan kind of work. They were tracking insurgents near a strategic pass when everything went wrong. It was a whiteout. A blizzard came out of nowhere. "We were ambushed," he explained, his voice flat, detached, as if reciting a report. "I got separated from my team. Took shrapnel in my leg. The last thing I remember is the snow turning red." He hadn't been found by a friendly patrol. He'd been taken by a non-state militia, a ruthless faction that didn't follow any rules of war. They kept me in an old Soviet-era bunker. A concrete box buried under the snow. For 2 years. Isabella's breath hitched. 2 years. The number was incomprehensible. 2 years of her life had been spent in the gray fog of the diner, while he had been in a concrete box. The thought was a physical blow. There was no contact, he continued, his gaze distant. No Red Cross. No rescue attempts. As far as the world was concerned, Major Vance was another casualty of the mountains. He described the long, dark days. The interrogations. The slow crawl of time marked only by the meager meals shoved through a slot in the door. The fight to keep his mind intact, to not let the crushing isolation break him. Then, he reached into the inner pocket of his uniform jacket. He pulled out a small, waterproof pouch, its material worn and softened by years of contact with his body. It was tied shut with a piece of frayed parachute cord. With unsteady fingers, he unwrapped it. Inside was the Medal of Honor, its silver and gold catching the diner's dim light. And next to it, folded into a tiny, fragile square, was a piece of paper. A letter. Her last letter. The ink was faded, the creases worn almost through. He pushed it across the table. "This," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he tapped the letter. "This was my Bible. My map. My only reason. Every time I thought I was going to break, I'd read this. I'd hear your voice." He told her about the escape, a desperate, brutal gamble during a transfer. And then, another year spent navigating hostile territory, a ghost trying to find his way back to the living. "When I finally made it to an embassy, they didn't believe me. I was a ghost on their files. It took months to prove who I was." Isabella picked up the letter, her tears falling onto the worn paper. Her words, written 5 years ago, had been his lifeline. "I never stopped thinking about you," he said, his eyes finally locking with hers, the raw vulnerability in them making her heart ache. "The thought of coming home to you, Izzy, it wasn't just a hope. It was the mission." Later that evening, as the neon, starlight, sign cast a warm, multicolored glow across the empty diner, a sleek black sedan with government plates pulled up to the curb. A man in a sharp, dark suit stepped out. He was in his late 50s, with silver hair and an expression that seemed permanently etched with stern authority. He entered the diner, the bell jingling softly. Isabella and Leo, who had been sitting in their booth long after the last customer left, both looked up. "Major Vance?" the man asked, his voice crisp. Leo nodded cautiously, his body tensing, one hand instinctively resting on Isabella's. "I'm Deputy Director Thorne, Department of Defense," the man said, extending a hand that Leo did not immediately take. "I believe I owe you both an apology." Thorne pulled up a chair, his movements precise and economical. He laid a thick manila envelope on the table. He explained the story from the other side, a story of bureaucratic failure, communication breakdowns, and institutional inertia. "Your unit's communication was wiped out in the ambush, Major," Thorne stated, his tone matter-of-fact. "In the absence of information, and after a 6-month search yielded nothing, protocol was followed. You were declared a casualty of the operation." Leo remained silent, his jaw tight. Isabella could feel the anger radiating from him. "When you resurfaced at the embassy in Pakistan," Thorne continued, a hint of discomfort entering his voice, "it caused a significant problem. Your file was sealed. Admitting that a decorated major was lost in the system for nearly 3 years due to a series of cascading errors was a public relations nightmare no one wanted to face. So you buried me again," Leo said, his voice dangerously low. Thorne had the decency to look chagrined. "You were put into debriefings. Evaluations. An extended reintegration program. It was mishandled. Grossly mishandled. There's no excuse." He pushed the envelope forward. This contains your full reinstatement, all back pay, and a formal, written apology from the Secretary of Defense." Leo stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. He looked at Isabella, at the years of pain etched into the beautiful lines of her face. "Paper doesn't fix this," he said, his voice shaking with restrained fury. "It doesn't give her back the 5 years she spent in limbo. It doesn't give me back the time I lost." A tense silence fell over the booth. Deputy Director Thorne didn't flinch, but he held Leo's gaze. "No, sir, it does not. Nothing can. All we can do is try to make it right, from this day forward." Isabella placed her hand over Leo's. She felt the coiled tension in his muscles. She looked from him to Thorne, and then back again. "It's okay, Leo," she whispered, her voice a calming balm. "It's the period at the end of the sentence. We have to let it end. So we can start a new one." Slowly, the anger in Leo's eyes subsided, replaced by the deep, weary love he felt for the woman beside him. For her, he could do anything. He picked up the envelope. "All right," he said, not to Thorne, but to her. He then looked at the director. "All I ever wanted, all I ever fought to get back to, is right here." Thorne nodded, a flicker of genuine respect in his eyes. "You both deserved better from your country, Major. I am truly sorry." The story of the soldier's return didn't just make the news, it became a part of the national consciousness. The video, discreetly filmed by a patron on their phone, went viral. It wasn't the grainy footage of the embrace that captured the world's heart, but the crystal-clear image of Major Leo Vance, a hero returned from the dead, standing tall and saluting the quiet, beautiful waitress who had never lost faith. Headlines praised his incredible story of survival, but the comment sections told a different story. One comment, which was liked over 1 million times, read, "Forget superheroes. This is the origin story I want to see. The story of the woman who held the light and the man who followed it home." Isabella and Leo didn't seek the fame that followed, but they accepted it with grace. Veterans groups sent letters of support. Flowers poured into the Starlight Diner, turning their corner booth into a temporary shrine. The staff officially named it the Lighthouse Booth, and a small, brass plaque was installed above it, "For those who wait, and for those who find their way home." Life didn't return to normal. It blossomed into something better, richer, and more profound. Leo, honorably discharged with full honors, began working with a local veterans outreach program, using his own harrowing experience to help soldiers navigate the difficult transition back to civilian life. Isabella stayed at the diner, now a co-owner, though she worked fewer hours. She no longer needed the armor of routine. Strangers would still stop in sometimes, just to see the place, to meet the woman whose love story had reminded them of what true fidelity looked like. Weeks later, Leo spoke at a local high school. He talked about duty and sacrifice, but his final words were for Isabella, who sat in the front row. "Never underestimate the quiet ones," he told the students, his eyes finding hers. "They are the lighthouses. They carry the heaviest burdens, and they never, ever let the light go out." People called him a hero, a title he accepted with humility. But every time they did, he would point to Isabella. "She's the reason I'm standing here," he'd say, his voice filled with a reverence that time would never diminish. Theirs was a love that had outlasted silence, bureaucracy, and even death itself. In the end, it wasn't the medals or the headlines that made the biggest impact. It was the quiet strength of a beautiful woman in a simple blue blouse, who reminded the world that the ones who keep the light on at home, they're fighting a war, too. What does true courage look like to you? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments below. Your story matters. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe to our channel, and share it. Let's make sure these quiet acts of heroism are never forgotten. Comment with respect. Thank you for watching.